Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch. A 60-year-old woman found out that the man she's been married to for the last 40 years has been cheating on her the entire time. She caught him cheating, and what she did made him fall to his knees. Today was Evelyn Carter's wedding anniversary with her husband, Richard Carter. For some reason, Richard was always away on this exact date. The couple had been married for more than 40 years, yet Richard had always refused to spend any romantic or special occasions with Evelyn. After finishing breakfast alone, Evelyn picked up the mop and began cleaning. As she passed by the study, something caught her eye: the mess piled up on the bookshelf. With a long, exasperated sigh, she set the mop aside and stepped into the study to sort things out. When she reached for the topmost row, a heavy book with a thick, intricate cover slipped and fell, striking her on the head. Wincing from the sharp pain, Evelyn hissed in frustration as she rubbed her temple. She noticed that the book was not an ordinary one. It was, in fact, a wedding album. Curious and unsettled, Evelyn opened it. Inside were pictures of a couple smiling brightly. They wore various wedding gowns and suits, the designs changing with each photo, though their expressions were consistently joyful and affectionate. Evelyn recognized the man in the pictures immediately. It was Richard. But the woman standing beside him wasn't her. Pressing a hand to her throbbing temple, Evelyn felt her head spin. She struggled to comprehend whether it was the physical pain or the ache in her heart that hurt more. The most recent photograph in the album was dated exactly 1 year ago. Even though the couple's hair had turned white, they still gazed at each other with the same infatuation as young lovers. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note in Richard's precise, elegant script. "Eternal love," it read. Evelyn flipped through the album, noticing each picture was labeled with a date from 40 to 60 years ago. The timeline of photos chronicled a story over the decades. Their hair had gradually faded from black to white, yet not a single year had been missed. It became clear, this was why Richard always had an excuse to avoid celebrating their anniversary. He had spent the last 20 years taking wedding pictures with the love of his life, and that woman wasn't Evelyn. Evelyn's hands trembled as she snapped the album shut. Her mind flashed back to Richard's demeanor before he left the house the day before. He had mentioned their son, Michael, was traveling abroad for business and needed Richard's help as a translator because the usual one was unavailable. At the time, the excuse seemed reasonable. Richard had been a foreign language professor before retiring. Evelyn had even suggested she come along, hoping to explore another country herself. But Richard's reaction had been cold and dismissive. "Michael is there for work, Evelyn. Why would you want to interfere? Besides, you don't even speak the language. You just make things more complicated," he said curtly. His response left Evelyn speechless, though she couldn't deny he had a point. Now, with the album in her lap, Evelyn began to question everything. Picking up her phone, she decided to verify Richard's story with Michael. "Michael, dear," she said carefully, "your father mentioned you're on a business trip together. I was just checking in to see how he's doing. Is everything going well?" There was a prolonged silence before Michael replied, "Dad's fine, Mom. He's healthy, even at 60, nothing to worry about." His tone, unusually candid, gave him away. Evelyn realized in that moment that her son was lying to cover for his father. Her heart grew cold, as if encased in ice. Ending the call with a few polite words, Evelyn set her phone aside and allowed silent tears to fall. She had never expected Michael, of all people, to be complicit in Richard's betrayal. Every year, Richard visited the same photo studio for his secret tradition. That day, Evelyn took a taxi to the studio, determined to confront the truth. After decades of marriage, she needed to see the betrayal with her own eyes to truly understand the extent of it, and perhaps to finally put an end to it. As the taxi pulled up, Evelyn noticed the sky growing darker. A storm was brewing. Her heart pounded as she approached the entrance, her steps hesitant and trembling. Through the window, she spotted him instantly. Richard was seated on a couch, dressed in a handsome suit. Suddenly, there was a glow in Richard's eyes. A tender smile softened his usually solemn expression. Evelyn followed his line of sight and saw an older woman step out of the fitting room. She was dressed in a beautiful gown, her silver hair styled elegantly into a bun with an intricate flower pin tucked into it. It was the woman from the pictures. Richard and the woman stood hand in hand, gazing at each other with deep affection in their eyes. Evelyn felt the world crumbling around her. Outside, the storm raged. The sky was ominously black, and thunder echoed in the distance. Evelyn hadn't brought an umbrella, so she ducked under the eaves to escape the downpour. Soon, one of the store employees came out to collect the signboards left outside. Noticing Evelyn, she called out, "Hey ma'am, it's pouring out here. Come on inside before you catch a cold." The clerk smiled warmly and ushered Evelyn into the store, her sales instincts kicking in. "While you're here, take a look at our collection of wedding dresses. You could even bring your husband in to take some wedding photos." Lots of our clients are older couples who never had the chance to do a proper wedding shoot when they were younger. They always say that love never expires. Evelyn trailed behind the clerk, her feet heavy as lead. Her heart sank as the words rang in her ears, triggering a flood of memories. She thought back to how she had met Richard years ago was still vivid in her memory. A matchmaker had introduced them. At the time, Richard had been busy building his career, while Evelyn worked as a cashier. Neither of them had much money, so they settled for a simple ceremony to mark their marriage. There was no wedding shoot. Richard had promised they would have one someday, once they could afford it. Evelyn had waited year after year, but decades passed, and now she was witnessing Richard taking countless bridal photos, not with her, but with another woman. She let out a bitter sigh, realizing how futile it was to have held on to such hopes. Inside the store, Richard was bent over, adjusting the gown for the woman beside him. The woman blushed and whispered shyly, "Stop that. It's embarrassing, I'm an old lady after all." Richard straightened slowly. Just as he was about to respond, his eyes fell on Evelyn standing in the doorway. His expression froze instantly. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice tinged with shock, guilt, and irritation. Evelyn caught the conflicting emotions in his eyes. Was he upset because she had intruded on his private moment? If this had happened when she was younger, Evelyn might have exploded with anger, demanding answers and airing her grievances. But now she felt numb. To her own surprise, her voice was calm, devoid of emotion, as she sought to maintain a semblance of dignity. "I found your photo album," she said simply. "I thought you might be here, so I came to check." Richard frowned, his face darkening with irritation. His first concern was not her feelings but the album. "Why were you going through my things? Did you put it back?" By now, other customers and employees were beginning to take notice of the commotion. Realizing he was drawing attention, Richard's expression softened slightly as he approached Evelyn. "Don't make a scene," he said in a low voice. "Sylvia and I were just lovers from the past. I have a family now and an established career. This is nothing more than me taking some pictures with her to make up for what we missed out on years ago." Sylvia. Evelyn's heart sank further as she recognized the name. Sylvia Clark had been Richard's first love. They had met in university while studying foreign languages together. The two had been inseparable, and their relationship had nearly led to marriage. But Sylvia's family had opposed the union, believing Richard was too poor to provide for her. In the end, they had been forced to part ways. As Richard spoke, Sylvia stood awkwardly nearby. Finally, she murmured, "Richard?" Richard stopped mid-sentence, his gaze shifting toward the storm outside. Turning back to Evelyn, he said firmly, "I need to take Sylvia home. She's prone to getting sick. Wait here for me. I'll come back and we'll talk once we're home." Evelyn could only watch as Richard took Sylvia's hand, leading her out of the store. As the rain poured down, Sylvia glanced back with a faintly smug expression, leaving Evelyn standing alone in stunned silence the entire time. Richard hailed a taxi and gently escorted Sylvia into the car before climbing in himself. Evelyn watched the scene unfold, stunned by the level of care and attentiveness Richard showed Sylvia. It was something she had never experienced from him in all their years together. Evelyn wasn't going to wait like a fool at the studio for Richard to return for her. She called a taxi herself and waited by the entrance. When the taxi arrived, she even asked the driver to step out with an umbrella to escort her into the car, ensuring she didn't get drenched by the rain. At her age, she was especially vulnerable to sickness. Taking care of herself was a priority now. Richard returned home 2 hours after Evelyn. The moment he walked through the door, his face was dark with irritation. "Evelyn, didn't I tell you to wait for me at the studio? Do you have any idea? I got drenched in the rain going back there to look for you." Evelyn, seated calmly with a cup of hot water in her hands, met his anger with a simple question. "How far is the drive to her place that I would have had to wait for you for more than 2 hours?" For a moment, guilt flickered across Richard's face, but he quickly changed the subject. "Help me wash my clothes and bring me something dry to change into?" His clothes were soaked, clinging to his frame, and his hair was plastered to the sides of his face in wet clumps. Without a second thought, he peeled off his wet clothes and tossed them at Evelyn's feet. For years, Evelyn had tolerated this kind of behavior. She had accepted the role of a dutiful housewife, tending to his every need because he was the breadwinner. Over time, she had even convinced herself that it was simply her duty. But now she felt a surge of resentment toward the way he treated her. Ignoring the damp clothes at her feet, she looked Richard in the eye and asked, "Are you going to explain the wedding album yet?" Richard seemed caught off guard by her persistence. He frowned, clearly frustrated, and began lecturing her as if she were one of his old students. "All those years ago, Sylvia and I had to split up because of circumstances beyond our control. Later, she came back to me, but I didn't divorce you because we had a child and other family obligations. All I want now is to fulfill the dream we couldn't achieve when we were young. Why can't you just let it go?" "We've been married for so long already," Richard said. Evelyn listened, her face unreadable. She regarded him with a tired expression as his justifications tumbled out. For the first time in decades, she evaluated their marriage with brutal honesty. Richard hadn't divorced her, not out of love, but because it was convenient. Evelyn had handled everything: meals, laundry, housework, and raising their children. She had spent her life attending to his every need, transitioning from a young woman to a middle-aged mother, and finally to the old woman she was today. A heavy wave of exhaustion settled over her. She sighed and decided she had no energy left to argue. "Wash your clothes yourself," she said. "I'm going to bed." Richard, already upset from being caught in the rain, was infuriated by her defiance. Muttering, "Unbelievable," under his breath, he snatched the clothes off the floor and stomped to the bathroom. Since he had never used the washing machine before, he spent ages fumbling with it, eventually sneezing from the cold. Frustrated, he called out to Evelyn in a grumbling tone, asking her how to use it. Evelyn, lying in bed, ignored him. Eventually, the sound of the washing machine whirring filled the house. Richard emerged from the laundry room, visibly annoyed. He began rifling through the wardrobe. "Where is my light blue sweater? Where did you put it?" Evelyn turned over in bed, continuing to ignore him. The tension in the room was palpable, like a volcano ready to erupt. Finally, Richard snapped. He grabbed a handful of clothes and flung them onto the bed, his voice hoarse with anger and frustration. "I've explained everything to you. Why are you still acting this way? Can we not live in peace anymore?" One of the buttons on the clothes hit Evelyn on the forehead, landing directly on the wound she had gotten earlier that day. She winced in pain, hissing softly. Richard froze, his eyes widening as he noticed the injury for the first time. He moved closer, looking genuinely distraught. "When did you get hurt?" "I didn't even notice," he said. Evelyn stared at him, her expression unreadable. Ever since they had met earlier at the studio, his attention had been focused solely on the wedding album and Sylvia. Of course, he hadn't noticed. She studied him for a long time, her thoughts drifting back to the past. In her younger days, she had been captivated by his good looks, which had eventually led her to marry him. But marriage, she had learned, was unpredictable. Her tone was calm, but her words carried a heavy finality. "If we can't live in peace anymore, then we shouldn't even bother." After the words left her lips, Evelyn suddenly noticed that all of the feelings she had held for Richard had gently dissolved. Richard neither agreed to Evelyn's thoughtful suggestion for divorce nor outright refused it. He chose silence. With that, they began stonewalling each other. The combination of being drenched in the rain and his advancing age took a toll on Richard. By the next day, he had developed a mild fever. In the past, Evelyn's reaction to his sickness would have been filled with worry and care, but now she felt indifferent. A small part of her even thought he deserved it. From that point on, Evelyn began cooking only for herself, preparing a single portion at each meal. After eating, she would head to the park for her routine yoga sessions or spend time shopping with her old friends. She also found time to look at houses, planning to move out in a few days. With no trivial household tasks to worry about, Evelyn discovered a newfound sense of relaxation. Soon, word of Evelyn's proposal for divorce reached her son, Michael. Since he was abroad, Michael didn't take the news seriously at first, assuming she would calm down after a few days. Everything changed when Richard's mild fever worsened and escalated to the point where neighbors had to call an ambulance. Evelyn was exercising in the park at the time. That was the moment Michael realized she was serious. He hurried back from overseas with his wife and daughter. While Michael's wife stayed at the hospital to care for Richard, Michael confronted Evelyn at home. "Mom, how long are you going to keep this up? You riled Dad up so much that he ended up in the hospital," he said, his voice sharp, acting as if Evelyn were the one in the wrong. He continued, "You two are too old to be arguing about divorce. Imagine what people will say if word of this gets out. I'm sure you two can show some compassion for each other and talk things out. There's no need to escalate the situation like this." Evelyn had previously avoided confronting Michael about why he covered for Richard, not wanting to disturb his work. But now she saw no reason to hold back. She cut straight to the point. "Do you know about your dad and Sylvia?" Michael froze for a moment before brushing it off. There was no hint of remorse in his tone as he rationalized the situation. "Is that why you want a divorce? Come on, Mom, it's just a photo shoot. What's wrong with that? Dad's a successful businessman. You can't blame him for regretting missing out on certain things in his life because he was focused on his career, especially at his age. If you won't go to the hospital to take care of him, then I'll have to call Aunt Sylvia." Evelyn listened to his justification in disbelief while packing the yoga suit that had been delivered to her recently. In the past, Evelyn's friends had often invited her to join them for yoga in the park, but she had always declined because it conflicted with her morning routine of preparing breakfast for Richard. Now, she no longer prioritized his needs. Since starting yoga, her aching joints had significantly improved, and she felt stronger. But seeing her son interrogate her like a criminal ignited a flame within her. Without thinking, Evelyn's hand moved on its own. She slapped Michael across the face. It was a rare occurrence. Evelyn had barely ever laid a hand on her son, even when he was a child. Michael cupped his cheek, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mom, did you just hit me? Are you insane?" Evelyn took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. "I am your mother. It is my duty to discipline you. What have you been learning in school all these years that you can't see the simple logic in this situation? Your father is my husband. Why shouldn't I hold him accountable for cheating on me?" Michael's face turned red with anger, his voice trembling. "You're a lowly, uneducated madwoman. I'm not surprised Dad is into Aunt Sylvia. He should have been with someone like her from the beginning. Someone with class." With that, Michael stormed off, slamming the door behind him. Evelyn stood motionless, watching his retreating figure. A memory surfaced of when Michael was a little boy. He used to cling to her at the front door, crying and begging not to be sent to school. Now, that same boy had grown into a man who wielded his words like daggers, each one aimed directly at her. His silhouette grew smaller the farther he walked until he turned into a faint line in the distance. He was now out in the world, a dagger aimed at her, ready to strike at any time. It was around evening when Michael returned home with Richard, who had largely recovered from his fever. The illness had taken a toll on Richard. He looked haggard and seemed to have aged overnight. Michael, on the other hand, remained stoic, his resentment over the slap still evident in his demeanor. Michael's wife greeted Evelyn politely enough, while their daughter ran over to Evelyn with a bright smile. "Grandma, please don't leave Gramps. I want us all to live together happily forever." Evelyn hadn't expected them to share their marital troubles with a young and innocent child. She gently pinched her granddaughter's chubby cheeks and assured her softly, "My dear, even if Grandma leaves, I will still make time to come back and see you." Michael scoffed loudly at the remark, his irritation evident. Richard, clearly exasperated, hissed through clenched teeth, "Do you have to do this?" Sensing the rising tension in the room, Michael's wife wisely took their daughter to another room to play. Now that the child was gone, Evelyn felt no need to hold back. "Since we're all gathered, let's talk about the divorce," she said firmly. Richard frowned deeply, puzzled by her insistence. He seemed genuinely unable to comprehend why she wouldn't drop the subject. Michael jumped in to defend his father. "Mom, Dad just got discharged from the hospital. Can't you give him a break? We're the only family you have. What are you going to do when you end up all alone after the divorce?" Their arguments carried the same tone, a mix of scolding and condescension, as though Evelyn couldn't possibly manage on her own. It seemed Richard had forgotten the sacrifices Evelyn had made for him when they were younger. Back then, Richard had nothing to his name. It was Evelyn who left the comfort and safety of her parents' home to move with him to the city, determined to build a life together. Not only had she worked tirelessly to make ends meet, but she also maintained their home while Richard studied for his university exams. Over time, their situation improved. Eventually, Evelyn became pregnant and left her job to focus on being a housewife. But just because Evelyn had chosen to be easygoing didn't mean she was willing to be treated as an accessory to someone else's life. She was only 60. Even without a job, she could support herself with her pension, and with the alimony she would receive after the divorce, she could live comfortably. Cutting them off mid-sentence, Evelyn smiled briskly. "All right, you two don't have to worry about me. Richard, you of all people should know how much I've sacrificed for you over the decades we've been married. I'm tired now. Let's just get this divorce over with as quickly as possible." While doing yoga in the park, Evelyn consulted other divorcees to learn about the process. To finalize a divorce, both parties needed to sign a divorce agreement and submit it to the court. After that, there would be a 30-day waiting period before the divorce was officially finalized. When the day came, Richard and Evelyn signed the agreement in complete silence. Not a word was exchanged. After Richard put down the pen, he stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity. In that moment, Evelyn thought she saw a flicker of tears in his eyes, but she didn't have the time or energy to worry about whether he was truly crying. The first thing she did was return to her room to pack her belongings. She only took her clothes and daily necessities, leaving everything else behind. Evelyn had already rented a small place elsewhere. She wanted as little contact as possible with Richard and Michael in the days leading up to the official divorce. One was a man who had been unfaithful for decades. The other was a son she had raised, only for him to betray her. Looking back on her life, Evelyn couldn't help but feel like a failure. Before she left, Richard stopped her, gently taking hold of her arm. For the first time in days, he spoke in an apologetic tone. "We've lived together for most of our lives. Are you really going to leave this family we've built?" Evelyn glanced around the house and felt an unexpected sense of serenity. "I've been thinking that maybe it's this family that abandoned me first," she replied. When Michael learned that Evelyn had not only made Richard sign the divorce agreement but had also moved out, he was furious. He showed up at her rented apartment, hammering on the door. The doorbell rang incessantly, but Evelyn didn't open it. Instead, she stood quietly, listening to his angry shouting from outside. "You're in your 60s. Did you really think you could still make anything of your life after getting divorced? Where are you going to find someone like Dad, who lets you live carefree at home every day? We used to be a happy family, but now you've gone and ruined it. For someone so old, you're a complete disgrace. Now I get why they say women are troublesome. You just have to create drama over something so minor. You better hurry up and go home to apologize to Dad before the divorce is finalized." The neighbors grew tired of his outburst before Evelyn did. Tasha, Evelyn's neighbor of the same age, suddenly threw her door open and bellowed, "Go to hell. Do you think being 60 years old means you're 1 foot in the grave already? We can easily live another 20 years, but not with someone like you. Living just a year with you is hell. Quit whining and scram. I'm done listening to you complaining, Michael." Evelyn's son was no match for Tasha. His objections caught in his throat, and he scurried away with his head hung low. 30 days passed in the blink of an eye. Evelyn and Richard went to the court to obtain their official divorce documents. The moment Evelyn received the document, a wave of relief washed over her. At that very moment, the weight she had carried for most of her life was lifted from her shoulders. Richard, however, didn't appear as relieved. He looked gloomy and tired, the fatigue in his eyes unmistakable. He clutched the document tightly, staring at Evelyn as though he wanted to say something. Before he could speak, a voice called out his name. "Richard!" Sylvia stood nearby, her face lighting up with delight when she saw Evelyn and Richard holding the divorce document. Sylvia had been waiting outside since morning, seemingly afraid Evelyn wouldn't show up to finalize the process. She slowly approached Evelyn and extended her hand for a handshake, smiling. "I am Sylvia. I used to be Richard's classmate and his first love," she continued. "The last time we met, it was raining and he rushed to send me home so I wouldn't catch a fever. We regretted not getting to marry each other all those years ago and couldn't get over it, which is why we wanted to take some bridal pictures to make up for it." Evelyn glanced at Sylvia's outstretched hand. Her fingers were delicate, suggesting a life untouched by labor. In contrast, Evelyn's hands were riddled with wrinkles and calluses. Evelyn smiled politely but didn't accept the handshake. "I know it must have been hard for you to hide like a rat under the sewers all these years. Now that I am divorced from Richard, you can finally fulfill your dream." Sylvia had been gloating, so Evelyn saw no need to remain civil. A group of young people nearby, visiting the court to get engaged, noticed the commotion. They threw amused, sneering looks at Sylvia. "This is the first time I've seen a mistress this old." "That's impressive. She's not just old, she's thick-skinned too. Look at the way she's dressed. Whatever happened to decency?" Sylvia's face darkened at their remarks, her hands still suspended midair. Richard stepped between them. He had always prided himself on his manners, but this must have been the first time he had been insulted so openly. Evelyn expected him to be infuriated, though he turned pale at the comments. To her surprise, he simply shook his head at Sylvia. "Let's go. Enough talk." After the divorce, Evelyn received 60% of their shared assets. Over the years, she and Richard had worked tirelessly and accumulated a respectable amount of wealth. When Michael found out about the alimony settlement, Michael became more pleasant toward Evelyn. He stopped criticizing her decision to divorce Richard and began visiting her frequently. His focus shifted to how much Evelyn would need him to care for her as she aged. Evelyn, however, saw through his theatrics. She knew he was only after her money. Michael seemed to believe Evelyn should save every cent for him to inherit. Instead, Evelyn began spending on herself. She purchased new furniture and clothes, and she even enrolled in a senior citizens course to learn foreign languages. When Michael learned of her spending, he stormed into her house, fuming. "Mom, just leave your money with me. It's safer that way. If you keep spending recklessly like this, how will we afford to take care of you in your 70s? Evelyn stared at him in disbelief, wondering how she had raised a son like this. She calmly declined and made up an excuse to get him to leave. After this confrontation, Michael stopped visiting altogether, leading to a fallout between them. For Evelyn, this was a relief. She could now focus on her foreign language classes and her plans to travel. In the past, Evelyn had been consumed by household chores. Whenever she had free time, she could only hope Richard would feel inclined to take her abroad. Now, she realized it was better to count on herself than to depend on others. These days, Evelyn's life was peaceful and mundane. Richard's, however, was total chaos. The wedding boutique studio had used the bridal pictures Richard and Sylvia had taken over the last 2 decades as part of a promotional campaign to attract older clients. Evelyn couldn't fathom what Sylvia had been thinking, but the woman didn't seem concerned about being labeled a mistress. She agreed to the campaign without hesitation. The advertisement, featuring an elderly couple deeply infatuated with each other, was incredibly effective and brought in waves of customers. Sylvia and Richard soon went viral online. Many netizens assumed they were a legitimate couple and couldn't stop gushing about how in love they were. But it only took a few days for the truth to come out. The other day at the court, someone had been filming the exchange between Evelyn, Sylvia, and Richard. Evelyn's face was blurred in the video, but Sylvia's and Richard's were not. Forever love? As if these two are a pair of venomous snakes, that's what they are, one netizen commented. There were several witnesses that day, and they all saw the old man divorcing his wife while his mistress shamelessly flaunted herself to the world. How can you live this long and still have no self-respect? The scandal began to fester online, and even the boutique studio came under fire for advertising what was now deemed a false romance. Under pressure, the studio released a statement. They claimed all they had done was take pictures for the couple. Furthermore, Sylvia and Richard had been coming for photo shoots every year, so they had no reason to question their relationship. This explanation only angered netizens further. This old man used to be the foreign language professor at my university. He seemed like such a respectable person. I would never have imagined he was such a scumbag. As if cheating isn't bad enough, he's been doing it for decades. I bet he wasn't a good person even when he was young. Sylvia hadn't expected things to spiral so out of control. Someone suggested that she move in with Richard and issue a statement claiming they had been deeply in love since their youth and had endured countless hardships to finally be together. Ever since Evelyn had left, Richard's life had fallen into disarray. There was no one to cook for him, and the house became increasingly messy with no one to clean. He ordered takeout daily, and his attempts at laundry resulted in unsorted clothes being dumped into the washing machine, creating a chaotic, disorganized mess. It just so happened that his granddaughter's school holiday fell in August. Since Michael and his wife were busy with work, they left Richard to care for her. Faced with the demands of childcare and housework, Richard welcomed Sylvia into his home. He needed someone who could keep things organized, and since he disliked the idea of hiring a nanny, Sylvia became the solution. On the first day Sylvia moved in, the family, Richard, Sylvia, Michael, and the granddaughter, took a family photo and posted it online. They added a dramatic flair to the post, sharing Richard and Sylvia's love story. Michael even left a comment under the post. Aunt Sylvia is a very intelligent and well-mannered woman. She's been great to all of us and gets along wonderfully with my dad. As his son, I'm so happy to see him reunited with his first love. Michael assumed that sharing the post would end the criticism as people would see the genuine love in Richard and Sylvia's story. Unexpectedly, even he became a target of the backlash. Netizens accused Michael of being a disloyal son with distorted values. If I'd raised a son with such a twisted mindset, I'd have beaten him, one wrote. As the saying goes, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I feel bad for the ex-wife. It's a blessing in disguise that she divorced them. Who'd want to stay with a family full of snakes? The situation continued to escalate. Even Richard's granddaughter became aware of the scandal. The young girl began asking. Sylvia faced difficult questions from Richard's granddaughter. What does mistress mean? Why did you break apart grandma and grandpa? Why is everyone calling you shameless? Although Sylvia turned pale at these questions, she managed to contain her anger and refrained from lashing out. Instead, she tried to rationalize her actions to the child, preaching her perspective on love. She claimed that in love, it didn't matter who came first. Even if someone was married, if you truly loved someone, you should fight for it with all your might, Sylvia said. She further justified that there was nothing wrong with being a mistress as long as the love was sincere. Richard's granddaughter, being only in elementary school, was highly impressionable. She absorbed Sylvia's warped ideas like a blank slate. To make matters worse, Sylvia's method of childcare was to hand the girl a phone and let her watch whatever she wanted, freeing herself from responsibility. Within days, Michael's wife noticed something was wrong. The child began eating very little, neglecting her homework, and spending hours glued to her phone watching romance dramas. At one point, the granddaughter began voicing her opinions about the shows she watched. The male lead and the mistress are in love with each other. It's not like the mistress did anything wrong. Mommy, are you sure you love Daddy? I think this nice lady in the show should be my mommy instead. Michael's wife was livid when she discovered this. After giving her daughter a stern lecture, She began investigating the root of the problem and soon pieced together what had been happening. As it turned out, Evelyn's granddaughter had been deeply influenced by Sylvia, her idea of love entirely corrupted. Not only did the young girl begin idolizing the role of a mistress, but she also started chatting with strangers online. Evelyn's daughter-in-law discovered this and immediately called her husband, Michael, demanding that he come home at once. "Look at what she's done to our daughter," she snapped, showing him the conversation logs their daughter had been having with strangers online. Michael clenched the phone tightly, his frown deepening with each message he read. When he finished, his first instinct was to punish his daughter harshly. However, the young girl cried and pleaded for mercy, wailing, "It was Grandma Sylvia who taught me. You were the one who said I should listen to her like I listen to my teachers because she's a well-educated granny." Michael froze, stunned, and turned to Sylvia with a look of disbelief. "Sylvia, I trusted you to take care of my daughter. Back then, my mother raised her just fine." Sylvia stammered, fumbling for an excuse, but before she could respond, Richard slammed the table and roared, "Enough of this! How much more disgrace will you bring to this family?" The tension in the room was palpable, with everyone seeming to harbor their own agendas. Not long after, Evelyn's daughter-in-law left with her daughter, while Michael's trust in Sylvia finally began to wane. Even Richard appeared distraught over the unfolding events. Evelyn learned about the incident when her daughter-in-law visited her, bringing Michael and a bundle of gifts as a gesture of apology. "Mom," Michael began earnestly, "now I see who has truly been looking out for us. When you were at home, we never had to worry about our daughter because you handled everything so well." His wife, speaking sincerely, brought Evelyn a cup of tea. Then she gave Michael a pointed look, urging him to continue. Michael's usual composure was gone. He looked exhausted, his bloodshot eyes a testament to sleepless nights and stress from work. Hanging his head low, he apologized to Evelyn. "Mom, I'm tired. We're family. There's no reason for us to hold grudges. I didn't appreciate what we had back then, and I see that now. Please forgive me. I still remember you tirelessly taking me to school, rain or shine, when I was a kid. No one has sacrificed as much for this family as you." Evelyn was shocked to hear these words. After all the harsh exchanges between them, she had assumed Michael had forgotten everything she had done for him. But some scars don't heal completely. Even when the blade is removed, the scar remains. Shaking her head, Evelyn replied, her voice tinged with conflict, "I've signed up for a foreign language class, and my classes are in the morning. Also, I'll be going overseas soon. I can't help you take care of your daughter." "Going overseas?" Michael and his wife exchanged startled glances. "Why would you go overseas all by yourself? It's dangerous. What if something happens to you?" Evelyn ignored their protests, handing the gifts they had brought back to them. "I'm part of a tour group with people my age, so it's absolutely safe. Just make sure you take care of your daughter." She then opened the door, signaling for them to leave. It was only upon opening the door that Evelyn noticed Richard standing outside. It had been some time since Evelyn last saw him. He no longer stood tall and proud. His clothes were wrinkled, and he looked like a shadow of the man she once knew. Richard's face grew anxious when he overheard that Evelyn was planning to go overseas. "Don't go, please," he begged. "At least take me with you. I can be your translator while you travel." Evelyn remembered how not long ago he had dismissed her suggestion to travel together, grumbling that she would be a burden. She asked pointedly, "What about Sylvia?" Richard froze, caught off guard, before stammering his justifications. "I swear, nothing has ever happened between us. We've been married for so many years. Why won't you believe me? I just wanted to make up for what I missed in my youth. That doesn't mean I don't want to spend the rest of my life with you," Richard said. Evelyn fixed him with a steady gaze and smiled gently, the same smile she had always given him in the past. Noting his puzzled expression, she continued, "When you were young, you gave up on Sylvia but couldn't stop thinking about her. Now that you've lost me, you can't stop reminiscing about how good I was to you. At the end of the day, you only realize the value of what you have after you lose it. You lied to me for 40 years and cheated on me for 20. You wasted half of Sylvia's life too. If you keep pestering me, It will only make me think less of you. Richard turned pale in an instant, his expression frozen as he struggled to find words. Evelyn could see the anguish in his eyes. Michael, unable to bear seeing his father so distraught, whimpered softly, "Mom." Evelyn, however, was done talking to them. She shut the door firmly, cutting them out of her world. It wasn't until 3 months later that Evelyn heard news about Richard again. By then, she had developed a solid foundation in foreign languages and was able to maintain basic conversations. One day, she received an unexpected call from Michael, who informed her that Richard was in the hospital. Apparently, Richard had been admitted due to carbon monoxide poisoning. From what Michael told her, Sylvia had been cooking when an argument broke out between her and Richard. They were so absorbed in their quarrel that Sylvia forgot to turn off the gas stove. Fortunately, the property maintenance staff happened to be inspecting the building's wiring and discovered the issue in time to rescue both of them. Sylvia's condition wasn't as severe as Richard's. She regained consciousness shortly after receiving treatment. However, upon waking up, Sylvia seemed to have entirely lost hope in Richard. She packed her belongings and left without even saying goodbye. Before leaving, Sylvia asked for Evelyn's number and sent her a brief text. "You won." At the end of the day, reality defeats love. Evelyn couldn't help but scoff. For her, there had been no competition to begin with. She had no desire to win Richard's affection. At her age, love was no longer something she craved. Without replying, she blocked Sylvia's number. Michael began pleading with Evelyn to visit Richard in the hospital, resorting to his usual reasoning. "Aunt Sylvia is gone, and Dad is sick. He keeps saying he misses you. I think his condition is more mental than physical. The best medicine he can get right now is just to see you in person." Evelyn closed the foreign language textbook she had been reading and responded curtly, "I'm not a doctor, so there's no point in coming to me for help. I believe you can take care of him just fine." The other end of the phone went silent, except for the sound of a faint sigh. Perhaps Michael was finally regretting something. Evelyn didn't tell anyone she was leaving on the day of her flight. As she was about to board the plane, she saw Michael swiftly approaching with Richard in tow. Richard carried a bag, and with great effort, he handed it to Evelyn. It was a simple gesture, but it seemed to take everything out of him just to extend the bag forward. Evelyn hesitated, but Michael grabbed the bag and shoved it into her hands. "This is the wedding dress Dad picked out for you. He says that after all these years of marriage, he never gave you the chance to wear a proper wedding dress. He owes you that much at least." Evelyn stared at the bag, which felt heavy in her hands. It smelled faintly of detergent, as though it had been freshly washed. She frowned, unsure of how to deal with such an unexpected and alien object. Richard seemed to read her thoughts. He coughed weakly before speaking in an exhausted voice. "I know I've let you down, and I don't expect you to forgive me. Please consider the wedding dress a symbolic end to our marriage. Take care of yourself overseas. Call me if you have time." He continued speaking, but Evelyn found herself tuning out. In the past, she would have given anything just to hear him express such basic concern for her. Now, his words carried no warmth. Instead, they irritated her. When the boarding announcement echoed through the airport, Evelyn nodded briefly and brushed him off. "All right, take care." That was all she said, her tone devoid of emotion. She didn't bother to add more pleasantries. Richard's face fell, a look of disappointment flashing across his eyes. Michael stared at her helplessly, but Evelyn remained unmoved. Letting them watch her, she walked away without a care in the world. After landing, Evelyn spotted the nearest trash can and shoved the wedding dress inside. She didn't need a beautiful wedding dress, certainly not one from Richard. Within 2 weeks, Evelyn had adapted to the culture of the foreign country she had moved to. She quickly made a few friends, liberal, open-minded individuals who didn't judge her for divorcing at an older age. "Women should live for themselves," one of her new friends said. "It doesn't matter how old you are. The most important thing is carving out a life that makes you happy." Evelyn found herself invited to outdoor activities and shopping trips. During her spare time, she learned new things she had never been exposed to before. She began posting photos of her travels on social media, documenting her newfound freedom. Each day was filled with joy. At 60 years old, Evelyn finally realized how fascinating life could be. A woman didn't need romance to find fulfillment. True fulfillment came from achieving freedom and living life on her own terms. Fortunately, she wasn't too late to discover this happiness. Then, if you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.